Hey everybody, Dan here with your review of Welcome to Marwen, the latest film from Robert Zemeckis, the great director behind films like the Back to the Future trilogy, Castaway, and so many more. Welcome to Marwen tells the story of Mark Hogancamp, a true actual person who was attacked in the early 2000s outside of a bar and was left with almost complete memory loss. Over the years in his recovery, he found that it was therapeutic for him to create miniature worlds with dolls representing real people in his life, a world that he named, in this film, Marwen, an actual life Marwen call, and found great prominence by taking photos of the worlds that he's created, which found a lot of acclaim on the art scene. Now, the reason that I say that this tells the story of Mark Hogancamp is that I'm not really sure that this tells Mark Hogancamp's actual life story, something that we'll get into a little bit. For the movie, at least, Steve Carell takes on the lead as Mark Hogancamp, and Leslie Mann takes on the second lead as Nicole, his neighbor across the street. And there are a lot of other actors that cycle in and out, but the movie really bores down on two relationships. The relationship between Steve Carell and Leslie Mann, and then the relationship between Mark Hogancamp and the world that he's created. Now, what Robert Zemeckis brings to this film, and something that he's been brought to a lot of his films, particularly in the 21st century, is a very unique structure and visual style. And Welcome to Marwen splits its storytelling between action in the real world and then action with storytelling using computer mocapped versions of Mark's dolls. So we'll see Steve Carell as Mark in an actual setting, and then we'll go into Marwen itself and actually experience stories with these dolls. It's set in 1944 Belgium, which is where the actual Marwen was constructed. And the movie kind of goes from there. I feel like there's a great story in Mark Hogancamp that Welcome to Marwen doesn't really tell, and actually doesn't really seem interested in telling. Welcome to Marwen is a movie that could have used a lot of subtlety. It is a very touching story. It's a very relatable story. It's about recovering from trauma. It's about the effects of repressed memories. It's about being different. It's about so many different things that you should be able to connect to. And unfortunately, Welcome to Marwen is very loud, is very bombastic, has very little subtlety to it, and is really just very unfocused. There are characters and threads that are woven throughout the movie that are dropped completely, never to be referenced again. There are storylines involving the real life story of what happened to Mark Hogancamp, what happened to his attackers, that are major driving forces for the movie, but that never reach any kind of conclusion. There's so much potential in this story that Welcome to Marwen doesn't seem to realize, in favor of going big and loud with its action sequences. And because it splits so much time, and because of the unfocused nature of really both sides of that narrative, neither one of the narratives really come together. There's a lot of metaphorical things that I think that the animated sequences are saying that are patently obvious, that I don't think that the audience needed a metaphor for. There are parts of Mark's story that are very easy to understand, but then in other parts it's very obtuse. There are characters that don't really seem like they need to be in the story. There are places that we spend a lot of time going that ultimately wind up nowhere. And I think that a lot of this has to be laid at the floor of Robert Zemeckis, the director. He is a brilliant cinematic stylist. He's brought so many great movies to the world over the years. But recently he seems a very, I hate to say the word, but self-indulgent. And that's what Welcome to Marwen feels. It feels like a director like Robert Zemeckis taking a story that should have been very touching and sweet and adding a lot of unnecessary flourishes to it, not the least of which are the animated sequences. Now, I think there is a way to tell this story in a very real and touching way that could have blended the live action and the sequences with the dolls. But this movie is not it. And there are also some other things that are incredibly self-indulgent in a different way. When Ready Player One came out earlier this year, it was very publicly talked about that Steven Spielberg said that he would not allow the references to his earlier films that were in the book Ready Player One to be in the movie because they would seem distracting. And there was a lot of conversation about that. Well, I think if you watch Welcome to Marwen, you'll see why Steven Spielberg made absolutely the right decision, because there are some absolutely baffling references to Robert Zemeckis' earlier works that are put in this movie that have no place there, that turn it into almost a distraction, a sideshow, and that are completely misplaced, that derail the entire narrative and what's going on. And that recurs throughout the film. This is a movie with great visuals, but no plan. Welcome to Marwen is definitely a big swing, but it's an even bigger miss. And it's the other weird things that Robert Zemeckis has done this before, and he's done it in more recent history. There's a documentary called Man on Wire, which tells the story of Philippe Petit and his journey walking across the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center back in the 1970s. Robert Zemeckis took the story of that documentary and made it into a 3D IMAX film called The Walk, starring Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And the criticisms I had of that film are almost exactly the same criticisms that I have of this film. You took a great story and added some wonderfully imaginative technology. They're both films that look great. They're both films that have so much craftsmanship behind them, and yet completely bungled the storytelling part of it. With The Walk, you have Joseph Gordon-Levitt's questionable French accent, his direct-to-camera narration. Everything that should have been native to the story was not native, and you bungled the entire telling of the story. The technical part was there with The Walk, and the technical part is there with Welcome to Marwen. But in both cases, these are really compelling stories that have been told better in real-life documentaries, which brings me to the movie that I would recommend instead of this movie, which is a 2010 documentary upon which this film is largely based, called Marwen Call. It's directed by Jeff Malmberg, and it tells the story of the real-life Mark Hogenkamp in his own words, and by seeing the actual Marwen Call that Mark built. I found it to be much more touching than this movie. Seeing his actual work, seeing what he actually constructed, not a recreation of it, and not these wondrous animated flights of fancy, that's much more effective and touching than anything on the screen in this film. And while Welcome to Marwen should not be asked to live up to the documentary, they're two different forms as far as film goes, it is telling that the actual story in a much more lo-fi form of Mark Hogenkamp's life easily beats out this very wondrous, fanciful flight that Robert Zemeckis has constructed. Welcome to Marwen missed for me on almost every count. I can't recommend that you go see it. It opens in theaters this Friday, but I will recommend that you seek out Welcome to Marwen Call. It is a really compelling documentary. It's not the most stylish documentary of all time. It's very bare bones, but I think it tells the story of Mark Hogenkamp, who he is, why he became that way, and the joy of his life, and what you can really learn on a human level far better than this movie. Well, that's all I've got to say about Welcome to Marwen. Did you see it? What did you think? As always, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear about it. This will be the last review here on Screen Junkies News for 2018, but we will be back in 2019 with so many more reviews, as well as breaking news and everything else. And of course, you can continue to catch us on Screen Junkies Universe and all across the other channels over the holiday break. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Dan Murrell. See you next time.